Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Douglas Bourn. I'm Professor of Development Education at University College London and Chair of the Academic Network of Global Education and Learning, the INGO network. I'd like to welcome you to this lunchtime, in UK times, it's lunchtime seminar on do development education NGOs deal adequately in terms of critiquing neoliberalism under sort of heading of rocking the boat. And the main speaker for this afternoon is Harmy Africa, who's a well-known consultant in this field. Okay, without any further ado, because of time, I'll introduce Stephen McCloskey from the Centre for Global Education in Ireland, who's going to introduce this, and then he will pass on to Harmy.
Thank you very much indeed, Doug. I'm just going to say a few words about why the Centre for Global Education decided to commission this research. We publish a journal called Policy and Practice, a Development Education Review, and we had been receiving an increasing number of articles over the past decade, raising the alarm about the lack of engagement by the development education sector with neoliberalism as the root cause of poverty and inequality. But we didn't have an evidence base to support the proposition that the development education sector in Ireland was sidestepping this issue. So the centre partnered with Financial Justice Ireland, an NGO based in Dublin, to secure a grant from the Community Foundation All Island Fund, which supports cross-border collaboration between civil society actors in the island of Ireland. We secured the grant. We commissioned Harmy to compile the research. We're delighted with the substance of the research. It's been really well received within the sector and generated an awful lot of interest. It confirms, sadly, what we strongly felt before we commissioned the research, that the sector does, at least in the island of Ireland, the sector does appear to be failing to engage the Irish public with the question of neoliberalism as the primary cause of poverty and inequality around the world. And there's compelling evidence to the effect that neoliberalism is the primary cause of poverty. And some of you may have come across a report published just last week by Oxfam called Survival of the Richest, which has a leading stat that says that since 2020, the richest 1% have captured almost 2/3 of all new wealth, nearly twice as much money as the bottom 50% of the world's population. So we have a problem with our broken global economy, but we don't appear to be engaging with this issue as a sector, both in terms of our advocacy work and our development education work with the public. And the question that looms over Harmyan's report, I think, is why? Why is the development education sector, at least in the island of Ireland, not sufficiently engaging with this question as part of its practice with the public? So we have submitted a follow-up, a fresh proposal to the Community Foundation to carry out another study based on the recommendations of Harmyan's report. We submitted the application last October. We're hoping that it'll be successful. The decision should be imminent, and hopefully it'll give us an opportunity to engage with this question of why a little bit in a more profound way. But for now, I think everyone would probably like to hear the presentation of the findings by Harmy and the presentation of his report. So Harmy, will I hand over to you to present your research?
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. Thank you, Doug, and hello everyone. Good to see you and to see your interest in economics and development education and the international development sector. Just to build on a little bit on what Stephen was saying, this was a small piece of research, right? It's not covering all of the bases to do with economics and the attention given to it in development education. But nevertheless, I think it does indicate some areas of neglect in the international development sector and possibly some areas of neglect within the broad development education global learning sector. What I'll do in the next 20 minutes is to give you a bit of a background to the research, give you a little bit of insight into how the research was set up, and give you some of the conclusions from the work that I've done in looking into what has been produced by the international development sector and the development education sector, particularly in Ireland, although there are occasional kind of sideline sources that I've used that are based elsewhere within Europe. So that was the big kind of question that the Centre for Global Education and Financial Justice Ireland, the two organizations that commissioned this report, asked me to consider. Are these sectors actually challenging the dominant economic paradigm? I think in the chat box already, the link to the report, if you want to read it in full, is available as well. So I'm not going to give attention to that. Coming back to the question of the why and the what for this research. In the terms of reference that I got from the two organizations who commissioned this, they referred back again to development education's radical origins in terms of addressing root causes of poverty and inequality. And the organizations felt that that should put development education into a very good position to start to look into issues of the free market economy, deregulated growth economy, and inequality. So a key kind of question that came up then for doing this research was actually, well, what's the attention given to root causes of poverty and inequality by those two sectors? And do those sectors actually challenge the dominant economic paradigm? And what I mean by dominant economic paradigm, I'll come back to in a little while. My research, and I think that's probably the case with most research, or all research even, is based on various assumptions and values. The report that I wrote clarifies some of them, but quite a few of them, for example, my own kind of take on the purpose of education and the values that education should try to promote or inculcate, if you like, amongst learners, I've left out. But two assumptions I've made, and they may give an indication of the values that I have, is that on the one hand, I think if international development is serious in tackling poverty, then it needs to give attention, including in its work with the public, to global economic processes and structures. It cannot avoid that if it is serious about tackling poverty and inequality in a fundamental way. Similarly, I also think that for development education to be effective in contributing to that tackling of poverty and inequality, it needs to incorporate economic systems perspectives in their work. So those two kind of thoughts are very much at the heart of how I approach this piece of work. And it shows a little bit about some of the values that I bring to that. So that's worth keeping in mind, I think. Just coming back again to the terminology of development education. As Stephen was saying earlier on, and as I mentioned as well, most of the research is focused on Ireland, with some spin-off to elsewhere in Europe. Now, in Ireland, development education is still a term that is regularly used within the sector that in other countries might be covered by global citizenship education or education for sustainable development, by global education, global learning, and similar kind of concepts. More so, I think the term development education is probably used in Ireland more than elsewhere within the European Union. At least in theory, there's fairly widespread attention to the original intentions of development education, something that I mentioned earlier on and that was shown in the terms of reference for this piece of work. That development education is an educational process that involves collective inquiry, collective dialogue, reflections on different perspectives, and collective responses, as well as individual responses to local or global issues. And the purpose for that educational process of inquiry, dialogue, reflections, responses is really to enable learners, to enable participants in the development education process to participate in the development of their community, their nation, the world as a whole. But for them to do that effectively, they need to have a sense of critical inquiry about local issues, about global issues, critical inquiry that is based, and critical awareness based on an understanding of processes and structures. So that original definition of development education from 1975, I think, is still in theory a basis for quite a lot of work of what goes on in Ireland to do with global citizenship education, development education. I say at least in theory. I don't know if you always come across it in practice. That a little bit on the terminology that is used in terms of development education. In terms of setting up the research, it's primarily focused on Ireland and based on a relatively limited range of source materials. It looks at selected Irish organizations. Amongst the 60 or so international development organizations in Ireland, most of whom are members of DOCAS, the Irish International Development Organization Network, I've selected a few, those listed over here, as well as DOCAS itself, and also I've looked into the Irish Development Education Network idea. Added to that, I've drawn on information from Irish Aid, from Concord, the European NGO network, and from the European Commission and the European Union. I reviewed their websites, basically looking into questions around how do they portray their work to the public that looks at that website? What do they say about issues to do with poverty, with inequality, with public engagement in their websites? Then, in addition to that, from those websites, where they were available and readily available, I looked at a series of policy and practice documents that are really pertinent to this whole issue of poverty, injustice, inequality, and root causes thereof. In addition to that, I started to read around more kind of issues, literature to do with economic development, with global economics, with systems thinking. And from that, you very quickly get a kind of sense that over the last 20 or so years, if not more, a lot of global economic development can be phrased as neoliberalism, even if people who do describe that global economic system do not yet necessarily use that term. They may use terms such as free market economics. They mean neoliberalism with that. Neoliberalism has got a variety of forms and implications and applications for it throughout the world, but basically it is based on a series of principles, which I'll come to in a minute. In addition to doing that kind of literature review and website review, I also organized, as Stephen mentioned, a number of workshops and a questionnaire that went out particularly to people in Ireland in the international development and development education sectors, but also to some known contacts that I had elsewhere in Europe. And I'll give a bit of an overview of what they came up with as well. In looking at the information that I gathered, I tried to use a kind of systems thinking approach. The reason for that is that, yes, you can look at individual issues of poverty or inequality, individual issues that are of real concern to many of the international development organizations in Ireland, but looking at the issues in their own right does not necessarily give you the ability to analyze the causes of those issues. And for that, I think it's useful to use a systems thinking approach. And I'm suggesting also that involving later on the public in looking into those global issues, that systems thinking approach is important too. Systems thinking, I think, assists in understanding complexity. It encourages you to relate different phenomena, different issues to each other and realize the complexity, but also realize how they dynamically influence each other. But by using systems thinking, it can also support kind of lasting change at a personal level, but also at an collective action level. So systems thinking I've applied or tried to apply to the analysis of the literature that I looked at from the different organizations and more broadly. I then used for systems thinking, I used something that was developed by a group of geography teachers in Birmingham in the 1990s called the Development Compass Rose. Now, you're all familiar with the compass rose, north, south, east, west, and what have you. And what that group of teachers did was to say, if we look at a particular locality, or if we look at a particular issue of change, can we look at it through a development compass rose perspective? And for that, what they did was to replace north with issues to do with nature. So issues, phenomena, questions about our interaction and the operation of the natural world, the natural environment. Or if you replace east with economy, starting to look at issues and phenomena and questions to do with how labor and capital and natural resources are being used to produce goods and services. Similarly, replacing south with society, you're starting to look at social and cultural issues. And when you replace west with who decides, you can incorporate political issues. That would be giving you an idea, so the Development Compass Rose suggests, of how interrelated different issues are. You may start from an economic perspective, but it has consequences for society, it has consequences for the environment, it has consequences for political decision-making. And similarly, that political decision-making, for example, may have consequences again for how society is organized or how it affects nature or the economy. I'll come back to that later on. So that systems thinking applied through the Development Compass Rose was something that I used in analyzing the information that I got. Coming back a little bit to the dominant global economic system, as I said, I didn't look just at the international development and development education resources, but did a bit more reading around that. And if you start to do that, then you notice that for the last 20 to 40 years, the most important economic affairs can be organized as a system, as a structure that's characterized through a priority being given to individual initiative rather than collective initiatives, without significant state direction of what those initiatives should be. State activities primarily concerned with giving access or enabling access by businesses to markets within a country or between countries, and encouraging that kind of free trade approach. A system in which the collective civil society organization and its influence on economic affairs is rather limited and sometimes, in some cases, actively discouraged. And also a system in which capital, as opposed to labor or as opposed to natural resources, is typically the deciding factor in what kind of economic operations take place. Part of that is then the promotion of a profit model in, for example, public services, privatization, public-private partnerships in education, in transport, in health. So from that reading of the broader kind of economic development documentation and literature, those were some of the key kind of characteristics that I picked out as relating to the current global economic system. In the report itself, I wanted to find out a little bit more, and also doing the research, I wanted to find out a little bit more about what that background was to neoliberalism, to that free market economics that I sketched out just now. And I took that as a starting point. A 1951 article by an American economist, Milton Friedman, who wrote in a business magazine that he felt the attention that the state at that moment was giving to fostering economic development in different countries was actually hampering economic development in those countries. He felt that the collectivist approach after the Second World War, in which the state very much said, this is the kind of economic development that we want to encourage. This is the role of, for example, labor in supporting that economic development, that was actually detrimental to the economic welfare of countries. Instead, what he wanted was something that was much more akin to the characteristics that I outlined earlier on. He said in that faith in what he called neoliberalism would take some time to show itself in the operation of economics. And indeed, it took about 20 years or so before you started to see an application of it. In theory, in economic studies, particularly initially in America, neoliberalism, as foreseen or as sketched out by Milton Friedman, became quite an important thing in the academic studies. But in policy practice, it wasn't there yet. Until the early 1970s, after a coup against the socialist Marxist government of Salvador Allende in Chile, where neoliberal policies were heavily introduced in reforming that country from a more collectivist approach to a more individualist approach. Later on in the 1970s, the United Kingdom, during Margaret Thatcher, and the United States during Ronald Reagan became big proponents of neoliberalism as a way of organizing the economy. It took a little while after that before neoliberalism, free market economics, became more of a global affair, and it took a debt crisis in the late 1980s, early 1990s for that ideology, for that faith, as Milton Friedman called it, of neoliberalism to spread globally. During the 1980s, various, particularly low-income and middle-income countries had built up quite a lot of debt in dollars in order to help them to develop their economies. They took out loans on the basis that they would pay off the interest on the loans and pay off the loans themselves because of their societies developing economically, and the economic growth would give the money to pay back to international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, but also to wealthier countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, France, etc., who had lent them that money. However, that economic growth did not appear. So when during the late 1980s, interest rates started to increase, lots of these countries were in dire financial straits, not being able to pay back their loans. The IMF and the World Bank at that point instituted a series of structural adjustment programs that were meant to support those indebted countries. But those structural adjustment programs involved a lot of the neoliberal kind of philosophies and practices, privatization, for example, the state getting out of the provision of public services in education or in healthcare or in transport. So that started to spread that neoliberal philosophy and practice more across the whole world. It's also worth noting that in a European context, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union's empire, similar kind of processes were taking place, not only in Russia, but also in countries like Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, whereby formerly collectively held resources, particularly public services, were privatized. At a later stage, during the late 1990s and early 2000s, during that whole process of economic globalization, that philosophy of neoliberalism and the attention to capital as the main driving force in promoting economic development became quite a key characteristic of shown through, for example, global value change, which basically mean that parts of the production of particular goods are carried out in particular countries that are then shipped to another country to complete the process of making a particular good. So that if you, for example, look at how a car is produced, an electric car these days, it will have source materials coming from Niger, from China, from Germany, from Ireland, from Britain, where the final product may be created. And that created a very much an integrated system that promoted that free market economics at a global level. Now then, going to the international development sector and what they've done in terms of looking into economic affairs in their websites and through publications that they made, it is quite noticeable that if you look at the approximately 60 Irish international development organizations, and if you look at Irish Aid and you look at the European Union, they all have kind of proposals on what they want to do about the issues that concern them. However, the vast majority do not give any indication of why those issues actually exist. They do not provide a systemic kind of analysis of why particular aspects of child poverty or why particular aspects of migration occur beyond saying this is an issue, it leads to poverty, or it exemplifies poverty or inequality, but it doesn't go further into the reasons for the existence of those issues. There are a few exceptions.
You've got 5 minutes, Harmian.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's great. A few organizations that do that, I've listed them over here. Some give attention particularly to poverty and hunger, other at inequality, other at the consequences of austerity measures, or at the growth of industrial agriculture. So it's those policy analyses that are particularly looked at. And if you then start to bring all of those analyses together, you notice that from the NGO reports, they all touch on the increasing income and wealth inequalities that have grown up over the last 20 years and growing poverty within and between countries. They all notice that returns to shareholders are prioritized to returns to workers and the public at large. They all, or virtually all of them, give attention to the consequences of privatization of public services. So that's the, if you like, coming back to the development compass rose, that's one aspect of it. But what they do too is that they then put it into a broader context and actually say, this has got consequences for how society is organized. This has got consequences to how we organize our relationship with the natural environment. This has got consequences for how policy decisions are being made. So they also draw that out. I'm not going to go through all of those details, but say in the case of society, they all notice the reduced role of civil society organizations. In terms of decision-making, policy decision-making, they all notice the dogmatism that underpins very often political decision-making. And in the case of our relationship with the natural environment, they all notice that that natural environment is being used particularly for the benefit of the powerful and those with money, rather than with the people who live there. So that's one kind of analysis that came from. The other bit that I looked at was then from within development education. The development sector, as is clear from looking at the previous reports, they do give some attention to economic development, but in their work with the public, attention to economics and economic systems in both the development and in the development education sector is of a minority interest. Recent resources produced within the development education sector in Ireland suggest that a maximum of 20% of resources actually gives attention to that. And actually some indications are that it's less than 10%. Generally, the sectors show a lack of evidence of exploration of economic processes and of system thinking. And very often where it does exist, according to some research in 2017, simplistic analyses are being provided rather than thorough analyses. Other observation is that typically where the public does get involved, it's through a campaigning approach and not through an educational approach. There's a focus, possibly because of that campaigning approach, on single issues, short-term issues, rather than longer-term fundamental systemic change. And the attention to root causes is piecemeal at best. Looking at questionnaire responses that I had from people in the development sector and in the development education sector in both Ireland and elsewhere in Europe, they tended to have the same opinions about it. It didn't matter which sector they belonged to. Generally, they were of the opinion that development and development education do not give adequate attention to root causes and to exploring root causes, and that use of education in public exploration of those relationships between poverty, inequality, and economic systems is largely absent. So from my research, the main conclusions are as follows. Amongst the selected NGOs, a minority challenges the dominant economic paradigm through analytical studies. In Ireland, and likely across Europe, the development sector and organizations belonging to it, to development education, do very little to engage the public in exploring economic causes of poverty and inequality. And similarly, that attention to economic systems and to root causes is largely absent. So those were the main kind of findings from my small piece of research that could do with a lot more detail, I'm sure, and it would be worthwhile to go into further detail, particularly exploring the reasons why development education and the international development sector do not give so much attention to it. But for this particular seminar, I would quite like you to focus on the following two kind of things. One, do these findings reflect your experiences, your information that you have available from your work? And secondly, should attention to root causes, social, economic, political, environmental, and attention to systems thinking be an important consideration? The question for the second one is really that systems thinking in the early part of development education, and particularly through global education in the 1980s, think Graham Selby and Pike, for example, in their work on global education, systems thinking was a key kind of part. But I think it's been neglected in development education, in global citizenship education, and other kind of areas of work. So it's over to you, really. Does this respond to your research experience, and is it important? But thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Harmian. That was great. A lot of very important points there to raise, and really very rich in terms of what you've said. And I've had the chance to read the report, and I found it a really fascinating piece of work. I feel that this area is actually so important that we shouldn't lose sight of it, because it touches on so many things and underpins so many of the key things that we talk about, but don't necessarily put it into practice. And I think that's something we should consider more. Okay, unless there's anything else urgent, I think probably to draw the session to a close, and like to thank Stephen for having commissioned the report, for Harmian to do this really excellent research that I think has really started to touch on some of the conversations that I feel we need to have more of, and also to greater depth on. I'm also conscious of my own work. That's one of the things that Alan has said I've had direct experience of as well, where students, both undergraduate and postgraduate, the sense of what the issues you're talking about are very complex, and that and what happens particularly when people come to university or put their experience of schools is very limited now. Economics is not one that's talked about a lot within a lot of schools or education systems. So I think it's something we could talk about more. Thanks everyone for coming, and we'll be in touch with you in the chat. There's details about forthcoming events, the work of the Teacher Education Special Interest Group within Angel, and also to say we have this major international conference in June in partnership with UNESCO, covering many of these themes in greater depth over 2 days. And just look on the Angel website, and we'll be sending more details about that in the next few days and weeks.